The desert wind has carried something different these past weeks. It carries words. Words from Washington that land harder than some missiles. Words that have shaken the corridors of international law, rattled the offices of the United Nations, and sent tremors through the quiet calculus of military command. From the battlefields of a war now in its fifth week, from the smoke still rising over Tehran, and the silent tanker lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, a question hangs heavy in the air. Has an American president crossed the line from military commander into war criminal? Not yet with bombs, but with his words. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes on sites and cities across Iran, assassinating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and several other Iranian officials. Wikipedia, https://n. wikipedia.org/wiki/2026_Iran_war. That was the opening volley. What followed was the kind of escalation that military textbooks warn about but rarely see in real time. Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone strikes targeting U.S. embassies, military installations, and oil infrastructure, including vessels in the Strait of Hormuz throughout the Middle East. Encyclopedia Britannica, https://www.britannica.com/event/2026-Iran-war. The strait, that narrow throat through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes, Wikipedia, https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/2026. _strait _of_Hormuz _crisis went silent. Ships stopped, prices surged, the world held its breath. The war that was supposed to be swift has not been swift. U.S. gas prices rose to a national average of $4.14 per gallon, an increase of nearly 39% since the war began. NBC News, https://www.nbcnews.com/world/Iran-war-trump-deadline-hormuz-infrastructure-C-spire-RCN-A267-039. The economic pressure has been immense, and in Washington, patience has run thin. What emerged from that frustration is a pattern of threats that legal scholars, military commanders, and allied governments now say may themselves constitute acts under the laws of war. Trump had set 8 p.m. Eastern Time Tuesday as the time by which Iran must make a deal, threatening to target Iran's power plants and bridges. On Tuesday, he escalated the rhetoric further, warning that a whole civilization will die tonight. CNN, https://www.cnn.com/2026/04/07/Middle East/Iran- Trump-deadline-infrastructure-what-we-know. That phrase did not pass without notice. It was heard in the United Nations building in New York. It was heard in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. It was heard by military lawyers who have spent their careers studying exactly this kind of language. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Rachel VanLandingham, a military law expert, said that Trump is both threatening a war crime and engaging in a war crime through that rhetoric itself. She explained that the law of war prohibits measures of intimidation against a civilian population, including threats of violence whose primary purpose is to spread terror among that population. PBS. https://www.pbs.org/news hour/show/what-Iran's-bridges-and-power-plants. These are not the words of an activist or a political opponent. These are the words of a woman who trained military commanders in the laws that govern armed conflict. In his Monday press conference, President Trump threatened to blow up every bridge and power plant in Iran, action so far-reaching that some experts in military law said it could constitute a war crime. PBS. The breadth of the threat was what alarmed them most, not a specific target, not a military installation with a dual-use argument. Every bridge, every power plant, the whole country. Trump's threat was so broad it did not seem to account for the harm to civilians, prompting Democrats in Congress, some United Nations officials, and scholars in military law to say such strikes would violate international law. PBS. Those who defend civilian populations in times of war understand what power plants mean. They are not abstract. Legal advisor Tess Bridgeman, who served on President Obama's National Security Council, stated that electrical generating plants power hospitals, schools, and water sanitation facilities, the foundations of basic civilian life, and that obliterating all power plants and threatening coercive actions against civilians to force a government to negotiate are flatly illegal. CBS News https://www.cbsnews.com/live-updates/Iran-war-plants-bridges-ceasefire-push-Air Force rescue. The question of what makes an infrastructure target lawful or unlawful is not simple. International humanitarian law does recognize the concept of dual use, infrastructure that serves both civilian and military purposes. Yale Law School international law professor Asli Bali explained that if a strike can show a real military advantage and that civilian harm was not excessive compared to that advantage, then a specific strike can be lawful. But the analysis of whether civilian harm will be excessive must be conducted in advance of any strike. NPR, https://www.npr.org/2026/04/07/N-X-S1-5-703/could Trump's threats, Iran's civilian infrastructure be considered a war crime. What separates a lawful military strike from a war crime, then, is the thinking that happens before the trigger is pulled, and when the stated intent is the destruction of everything, every bridge, every generator, every desalination facility. That prior analysis collapses entirely. The Pentagon prepared options for Trump that include targets used for both military and civilian purposes. Targeting infrastructure considered dual use could allow the administration to argue the U.S. is hitting military targets and avoid the technical definition of a war crime. NBC News https://www.nbcnews.com/world/Iran/live-blogs/live-updates-Iran-war-Trump-deadline-hormuz-infrastructure-ceasefire-RCN A2670039. That is the legal architecture being quietly constructed around the threats. But Trump has been threatening all of Iran's civilian infrastructure in blanket warnings, suggesting the U.S. will conduct indiscriminate airstrikes. And even the president's rhetoric in and of itself could be treated as a possible war crime by issuing repeated threats that arguably spread terror among a civilian population. NBC News https://www.nbcnews.com/world/Iran/live-blogs/live-updates-Iran-war-Trump-deadline-hormuz-infrastructure-ceasefire-RCNA 267. Inside Iran, the effect on ordinary people has already been significant. An Iranian official urged young people to form human chains around power plants. A young teacher in Tehran, speaking anonymously for safety, said that if electricity, water, and gas disappear, we're really going back to the Stone Age. PBS https://www.pbs.org/news-hour/world/Trump-warns-a- civilization-will-die-tonight-if-a-deal-with-Iran-isn't-reached. These are not combatants. These are the civilians that the laws of war were written to protect. The United States has been here before, not as target, but as accuser. The United States strongly condemned Russia, and the State Department concluded that Russia was engaged in war crimes of indiscriminate attacks for taking out power plants and electrical infrastructure in Ukraine during the dead of winter, plunging Ukrainians into life-threatening cold without definite military advantage. PBS https://www.pbs.org/news/what-international-law-says-about Trump's threats to bomb Iran's bridges and power plants. The parallel is uncomfortable. The same government that prosecuted that argument in Geneva and New York is now advancing threats that legal scholars say mirror the same conduct. When a New York Times reporter raised this contradiction directly, Trump responded, "I hope I don't have to do it," but then argued that the mere possibility of a nuclear Iran is so intolerable that it justifies breaking international law. MS Now, https://www.ms.now/opinion/Trump-Iran-war-threats-Hormuz-deadline. That argument, that the ends justify the means, that enough danger permits the abandonment of legal constraint, is exactly what the laws of war were designed to prevent any party from claiming. It is the argument made by every belligerent who has ever bombed a hospital, a school, a water treatment plant, and called it necessary. Tehran's United Nations representative Amir Saeed Iravani said Trump's threats constitute incitement to war crimes and potentially genocide. Amnesty International's Secretary General Agnes Callamard said the comments may constitute a threat to commit genocide toward Iran's over 90 million people, and called on the UN Security Council to urgently intervene. PBS https://www.pbs.org/news/world/trump-warns-will-die- tonight. -if-with-Iran- isn't- reached. The word genocide carries legal weight that cannot be dismissed. It is the heaviest word in the vocabulary of international law, and its invocation by a major human rights body in response to an American president's social media posts marks a moment that historians will not overlook. The UN spokesman said the question of whether attacks on civilian infrastructure would be considered war crimes would have to be decided by a court. However, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute noted that accountability would more likely come from Congress, and that international law only works if sovereign nations are willing to cede their sovereignty to a foreign body. PBS https://www.pbs.org/news/hour/politics/watch-live-higgseth-and-king-hold-pentagon-briefing-as-Trump-threatens-Iran's-infrastructure. That is the honest truth of where things stand. The architecture of international law exists. The Geneva Conventions exist. The law of war exists inside the Pentagon's own manuals, but enforcement requires political will that no court can manufacture on its own. Lieutenant Colonel VanLandingham advised U.S. military commanders to follow their oath to the Constitution and to the law, and to ensure that discrete analysis is done on every single power plant and every single bridge on a targeting list to confirm it is a lawful military objective and that the strikes are proportionate. PBS https www.pbs.org NewsHour show what international law says about Trump's threats to bomb Iran's bridges and power plants. That guidance, steady, professional, rooted in decades of training, reflects what the military knows even when the commander-in-chief's words run in a different direction. As the deadline came and passed on Tuesday evening, strikes were reported on or near critical infrastructure sites. The U.S. struck military sites on Karg Island, Iran's key oil export hub, though it did not target oil facilities directly. Multiple railway lines, freeways, and bridges across Iran were struck, including one attack on a railway bridge that killed 2 people. CNN https://www.dcn.com 2026 or 407 Middle East, Iran, Trump deadline infrastructure, what we know. The war has not yet become the total annihilation the rhetoric threatened, but the rhetoric itself has done damage to U.S. credibility, to the framework of international humanitarian law, and to the moral position that America has long claimed as its own on the world stage. What has happened here, on this ground, in this war, is something that legal scholars will argue about for years. The threats have been made. The words are in the record. Whether they translate into action, and whether that action then faces any reckoning, is a question this conflict has not yet answered. But the question itself has already changed the nature of this war.